This is William Pitt, the younger Prime Minister of Great Britain and Chancellor of the Exchequer, that is Treasurer, in 1788, when Australia, or rather New South Wales, was being settled by the British. He was the first then in a long line of treasurers. Following the 2024 budget, the present budget, I was asked in 2 interviews whether I had watched the budget. I said, well, I did have the television on, but I wasn't giving it the attention I once did. The way the budget is leaked reveals an extraordinary arrogance, a belief that Australians are stupid and don't realise what the politicians are up to. Either we have a budget or we have a series of press releases. Do we really have to go through this fourth-rate theatre when little bits are revealed or leaked, and then we have the budget? Now, my advice to the government, apart from stopping the lies, is as follows. First, the government should abandon Canberra's standard solution for every problem. It's twofold. It's a bucket load of taxpayers' money and a uniform solution which is magically only known to Canberra. Make everything uniform, apply it from Canberra and give them money. That's their solution. Whereas the ideal in a federation is to try out different things in different states in those areas of state powers so you can see what works best. My second suggestion is that Canberra stop nosing into matters the Constitution reserves to the states. Now, that is a heresy these days. The original High Court said, well, obviously, those powers not given to the Commonwealth are reserved to the states. They were referring to a doctrine in the United States which is written into the United States Constitution, which says that those powers not granted to the federal government are reserved either to the states or to the people. Well, that's obviously what happened in Australia, but an activist High Court decided that they would change that, and that allowed them to give an extensive definition of each of the federal powers. The cost of Canberra duplicating what the states are doing, having, for example, a Department of Education without having any schools whatsoever, is very costly for you, the taxpayers. A few years ago, a study done by Professor Anne Toomey, a professor of law at the University of Sydney, and Professor Withers, came to the conclusion that the cost of this was probably more than we realised. They said it was 11% of gross domestic product. Today, with the current gross domestic product, this would be more than $275 billion. $275 billion. That's not once, that's every year. $275 billion for Canberra duplicating what the states do. And when Canberra does that, it means they don't attend to the powers that they were given by the Constitution at the time of Federation. And leading these is defending Australia. And they've really let the defence of Australia run down while they push their noses into matters which are better left to state governments. Remember, $275 billion, not once, but every year and rising. My third piece of advice to the Commonwealth at the time of the budget is to adopt a gas reservation policy. This has been done in Western Australia by a very wise Premier, Premier Carpenter, a Labor man, who when the cartel, who dominates on the East Coast, when they came to him, this is a cartel of foreign gas producers, they came to him and they said, well, we want to develop West Australia's gas. He said, very well, but 15% of it has to be for the domestic market. They said, oh, we can't do that, so they walked away and left him. They came back soon after when they realised he meant it, and they said, oh yes, well, we can cope with that. So 15% of gas in Western Australia is released onto the domestic market at local prices. Foolishly, in the much bigger eastern market, the 3 eastern states, we have to buy the gas back at international prices. The cartel is doing wonderfully on the eastern side because of the foolishness of our politicians. So I would say have a domestic reservation policy, as all of the oil producers have. Nowhere in any oil-producing country, all of the Arab oil-producing countries, do you pay higher prices for oil. Oil is cheap in those countries, as it should be. But our politicians have let that one go. That's something that ought to be part of the budget. My 4th piece of advice is this. Until every country plays the net zero game, every important country producing CO2 plays the same game of going down and reducing emissions down to net zero, or alternatively, until Donald Trump returns to the White House, because he will, again, I'm sure, declare global warming to be a hoax. Why do we play the net zero game? Why do the politicians impose net zero or reducing emissions, closing down coal-fired stations, for example, while the Chinese communists and several other powers, the Indians, for example, just take no notice of it? Why have we got to do this? Why do our politicians impose something on us which has no impact on the climate? Because if we're reducing our CO2 emissions, but we're selling our coal anyway overseas, how does that make any impact on the climate if global warming theory is in fact correct? I believe it's a hoax, as Donald Trump does. My 5th suggestion to the politicians is to honour the promise, Mr. Albanese, you frequently expressed in the last election to reduce electricity prices by $275. And you're not satisfying that promise by increasing prices by about $1,000. That's what's happened under the Albanese government. Electricity prices for the average home have gone up by $1,000. You're not reducing it then by $275. And you're not reducing it by giving people $300 of their own money from their own taxes. That's not reducing the price. My 6th suggestion to the Albanese government for their next budget is stopping Mr. Albanese from waking up every so often in the morning and deciding suddenly he must give yet another $1 billion to some investment by rich men, which they say is so good they don't fund it 100% themselves. Why are we giving billions of dollars to these investments and claiming that it will improve manufacturing in Australia? My 7th piece of advice to the government is to learn the essential truth that everybody knows. Governments are notorious failures in picking winners. Governments are very bad at investing. And that relates to my 8th piece of advice. There's no such thing as a green superpower, and governments should stop pretending there is. And hydrogen is not yet a serious alternative as a fuel. My 9th piece of advice to the government is something which Australians, according to the polls, are now realising. Renewables are far more expensive than most other fuels because they can't be used all of the time, because the sun doesn't shine all of the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So you've got to have forming power which will support that. My 10th piece of advice is, just as it's in the nature of a scorpion to sting, a socialist government, a communist-style government ought to know, and strangely the Albanese government doesn't seem to realise this, that it is the nature of a monopolist, including oligopolist in a cartel, to gouge prices. That's what monopolists do. All theory shows that what monopolists do is to compete on trivial things like advertising. They never compete on price. If there's a group of them in a cartel, they gouge prices. That's in the nature of monopolists. The Americans have known this for a long time, and for over 100 years, particularly in the Sherman Act, they've had ways to deal with this. And in their legislation, their antitrust legislation, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, they make provision for divestiture as the final remedy in relation to recalcitrant monopolists and oligopolists who refuse to behave as if they're working under competition. That has to be compelled, and you only do it through having sanctioners available against monopolists. Why the Albanese government does not do this is incomprehensible, given that Mr. Albanese belongs to the far left socialist faction of the Labour Party and ought to realise what monopolists are up to.